Thank you for tuning in to Module 4 in the 2025 Municipal Affairs Election Training Program. This module will focus on third-party advertising. The nomination period officially started on January 1st, 2025, and the third-party election advertising period started on May 1st. So you may already be getting questions about third-party advertising. As a bit of a disclaimer, this video is intended as an introduction and overview of some of the things you need to know as a returning officer. This presentation does not provide a comprehensive review of the legislation and is not legal advice. If you have questions about how the legislation applies to specific facts, make sure to get advice from your legal counsel. If you watched our previous presentations, you already know that our 2025 election training will be delivered in pre-recorded videos and posted to the Municipal Affairs website throughout the election year. If you haven't watched these presentations, please take some time to watch them. In Module 4, we're focusing on third-party advertising. Modules 5 and 6 will be coming later this spring, and the remaining modules will be made available over the course of summer 2025. In addition, the elections database videos provided by our information services team are up on our election resources page, along with a new specialized returning officer training program for summer villages. As with our previous modules, the goal in Module 4 is to provide returning officers with an overview and a general understanding of the topic. If someone planning on advertising as a third party during the election contacts you, you should suggest they read Part 8 of the LAEA in its entirety and to consult a lawyer familiar with the topic, as this is a very technical aspect of the Local Authorities Election Act. Okay, so let's first get into third-party advertisers and election advertising. So a third-party advertiser could be an individual, a corporation, a trade union, employee organization, or another group that raises or spends funds, or who plans to raise or spend funds for advertising to promote or oppose a candidate. A third-party advertiser does not include a candidate. The Local Authorities Election Act includes rules that third-party advertisers must follow, including disclosure requirements for third-party advertising and financing. These rules create accountability and transparency by requiring third-party advertisers to record and disclose information about their advertising and financing activities. This includes disclosures regarding advertising contributions and expenses. Third-party advertising rules ensure that Albertans are aware of who is paying for and placing election advertising. Third-party advertising is not the same as a candidate's campaign and must be conducted independently of a candidate. Any advertisements or materials that are made and distributed by a candidate or under a candidate's direction are part of the candidate's campaign and are subject to the candidate's election financing and contribution disclosure obligations. So what is election advertising? Election advertising is defined in the LAEA as the transmission to the public by any means during an election advertising period of an advertising message that promotes or opposes the election of a candidate or takes a position on an issue that is the subject of a vote on a bylaw or question. Election advertising includes canvassing for the benefit of a candidate and organizing events where the primary purpose of the event is to promote or oppose a candidate. Third-party advertising is only regulated during the election advertising period, which we've seen begins May 1st. Advertising conducted outside of this period is not subject to third-party advertising rules. Election advertising does not include such things as, first, the transmission to the public of an editorial, a debate, a speech, an interview, a column, a letter, commentary, or news. It does not include the distribution of a book or the promotion or the sale of a book for no less than its commercial value if the book was planned to be made available to the public regardless of whether there was to be an election. It does not include the transmission of a document or the communication directly by a corporation or a group to its members, employees, or shareholders. It does not include the transmission by an individual, corporation, or group on a non-commercial basis on the internet of the political views of that individual, corporation, or group. It does not include making of telephone calls to electors only to encourage them to vote. It does not include advertising by the local jurisdiction in any form, or the transmission to the public in a local jurisdiction that is not a local jurisdiction for which the advertising message was intended and in which there is no candidate. Third-party advertising must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And these are some of the questions that you'd want to consider when determining if something is third-party advertising. Keeping in mind that as a returning officer, you are not obligated to decide whether or not something is third-party advertising or not. If you do get questions like that from third-party advertisers, make sure to tell them to get legal advice. However, just for your own information, so you understand how this works, if the answer is yes to any of these questions, the message could be considered election advertising. There are certain kinds of communications and publications that are more likely to be considered election advertising, like TV, radio, and newspaper ads. Other kinds of communications, like private communications or news stories, most likely do not qualify as third-party election advertising. This, of course, is not an exhaustive list of examples, and there may be some exceptions. However, this will give you an idea for the kinds of things that may qualify as election advertising. Okay, so let's move on to the registration of third-party advertisers. An eligible third party must apply for registration in a local jurisdiction when advertising expenses of at least $1,000 have been incurred or intend to be incurred, or when the third party has accepted or intends to accept advertising contributions of at least $1,000. A third party may apply to the registrar for registration when it is registered in more than 10 local jurisdictions. When a third party is registered with the registrar, its registration with any local jurisdiction is deemed to be cancelled. If a third party is registered with the registrar, it is no longer required to apply for registration with the local jurisdiction. Local jurisdictions and the registrar must maintain a register of third parties who engage in election advertising, which is to be made publicly available during business hours. Let's talk about ineligible third parties, and this is discussed in section 163 sub 6. Corporations that are prohibited from making advertising contributions include municipalities, Métis settlements, school boards under the Education Act, public post-secondary institutions under the Post-Secondary Learning Act, registered charities, publicly funded corporations. Please refer to section 1 sub L of the Election Finances and Contributions Disclosure Act. This will provide you a complete list of prohibited corporations. The application for registration of a third party is in Form 27, and it requires the following information: the name and contact information of the individual, corporation, and officer with signing authority, the group and principal officers, members who are to be a third party, requires the Alberta address where records are kept and communications addressed, the name and contact of the chief financial officer, name and address of financial institutions, the names of the signing authorities for the advertising account, any additional information required by the local jurisdiction concerning an advertising account. If the third party has a governing body, a copy of the resolution passed by the governing body authorizing the third party to incur election advertising expenses must also be included with the application. The duties of the local jurisdiction and the registrar are essentially the same. Both must accept and review applications for registrations in Form 27 and notify third-party advertisers of acceptance or refusal of an application. Local jurisdictions and the registrar must also maintain a register and make updates as requested by third-party advertisers, and may cancel registration for the reasons outlined in Section 164 including upon application for a cancellation by a third-party advertiser, or if required disclosures are not filed. Registration under a name that may cause confusion is not permitted. A local jurisdiction shall not register a third party if the name or the abbreviation of the name so nearly resembles the name or abbreviation of the name or a nickname of a candidate who is active anywhere in that local jurisdiction, such that confusion is likely, or the proposed name was the name of a registered third party whose registration with the local jurisdiction was canceled or whose name was changed since the last election. No third party shall apply to the registrar for registration under a name or the abbreviation of the name that so nearly resembles the name or abbreviation of the name or a nickname of a candidate that is active anywhere in the province, such that confusion is likely. The registrar shall not register a third party if the proposed name was the name of a registered third party whose registration with the registrar was cancelled or whose name was changed since the last election. Please also note that Section 205 of the Local Authorities Election Act obligates a local jurisdiction, a returning officer, or the registrar to refer any complaint or allegation received under Part 8 to the Election Commissioner, that is, Elections Alberta. They must also report any act or omission that, in their opinion, likely constitutes an offence under Part 8. Moving on to advertising expenses and contributions. No third party required to be registered under Section 163 and no individual acting for a third party required to be registered shall accept advertising contributions or incur advertising expenses unless the third party is registered under Section 163. We've already talked about registration, so now let's get into advertising expenses and contributions.
The expense limits regulation outlines the expense limits for each year in the campaign period and provides the formulas for how the limits are calculated. Third-party advertisers need to be aware of the regulation and their responsibilities under it. While returning officers are not expected to provide specific advice to third-party advertisers about how to calculate their expense limits, you should be prepared to answer some high-level questions about the regulation and ensure that third-party advertisers understand they may need independent legal advice if they have concerns about their obligations. Please note that the expense regulation was recently amended to state that in respect of the 2025 election, the number of persons residing in an area at the start of the campaign period is to be determined using the 2024 Municipal Affairs Population List, available on the Open Alberta website.
There is a difference between an advertising expense and an expense under Part 8 of the LAEA. You might think of an advertising expense as something directly related to the production or transmission of an advertising message. Expenses relate to other costs that may be incurred by a third-party advertiser that need to be valued. Keep in mind that advertising contributions do not include volunteer labor, professional services provided free of charge for work relating to compliance with the Local Authorities Election Act, services provided free of charge by the Chief Financial Officer, or services that a third party provides in support of its own campaign. These definitions and the distinctions between them are nuanced, and their application to real facts can create confusion. Returning officers who are asked to provide candidates or third-party advertisers with advice about the application of these definitions and rules to particular facts should recommend legal advice. The Local Authorities Election Act does, however, provide some guidance on how advertising expenses need to be handled, authorized, valued, and reported. The definitions in Section 162, along with Sections 165, 166, and 178, explain how expenses are to be understood in Part 8 of the Local Authorities Election Act, while Section 179 explains the rules for the identification of third-party advertisers. Third-party advertisers should also be familiar with the Minister's third-party advertising guidelines, which are passed pursuant to Section 179. These guidelines provide further rules respecting the identification of third-party advertisers and can be found on the Municipal Affairs Election Resources page. In Part 8 of the LAEA, advertising contributions include money provided to or for the benefit of a third party, or real property, goods or services, or the use of real property, goods or services provided to or for the benefit of a third party without compensation from that third party for the purpose of election advertising. Services, however, do not include volunteer labor provided by an individual, so long as that individual does not receive from that individual's employer or any person compensation or paid time off to volunteer. Does not include professional services provided free of charge for work relating to compliance with the Local Authorities Election Act. Does not include services provided free of charge by an individual acting as the chief financial officer of the recipient of the services for work relating to compliance with the LAEA, or services that a third party provides in support of its own campaign. However, services does include services provided by an individual who is self-employed if those services are normally charged for by that individual. Please also be aware that there are some prohibitions on who may make contributions to a third-party advertiser. The following are prohibited from making contributions: an individual ordinarily resident outside of Alberta, a prohibited corporation as defined in the Election Finances and Contributions Disclosure Act, a trade union or employee organization that is not an Alberta-based trade union or employee organization, a registered charity, or a group of which any member of the group is ordinarily outside of Alberta, a prohibited corporation, a trade union, or employee organization, unless an Alberta-based union organization. If a third party knows or ought to know that an election advertising contribution is going to be made by a prohibited person, corporation, union, charity, or group, they shall not accept it directly or indirectly. In addition to not accepting contributions from prohibited contributors, no third-party advertiser and no individual on its behalf shall solicit or accept any advertising contribution if they know or ought to know that the contribution does not actually belong to the contributor. Receipts for advertising contributions must be issued, and the contributions must be deposited in an advertising account. There are also additional rules for group contributions. An advertising contribution from funds collected from a group's members may be attributed to its members only if, first, the amounts paid by its members were made on a voluntary basis, and if it was made explicit that the amounts being collected were for election advertising. And three, the names of the members who made the payments and the amounts they each paid are recorded by the group and, if applicable, provided to the third party. Third-party advertisers may borrow money only from a financial institution. The loans must be recorded and the terms reported either to the local jurisdiction or to the registrar. The gross income from any fundraising function must be recorded by the chief financial officer of the third party that held the function or on whose behalf the function was held. The aggregate amount of contributions less than $50 must be recorded by the chief financial officer, even though the individual amounts of $50 or less are not considered to be advertising contributions. Anonymous contributions of more than $50 and any advertising contribution or portion of a contribution made in contravention of Part 8 accepted by a registered third party must not be used or expended. And the registered third party must return the advertising contribution or the portion to the contributor if the contributor's identity can be established, or if the contributor's identity cannot be established, pay an amount equivalent to the advertising contribution to either the local jurisdiction or the registrar if the advertiser is registered provincially. The local jurisdiction or the registrar will provide direction on the return of contributions accepted from contributors contrary to sections 167 and 176. If the chief financial officer of a third party learns that an advertising contribution was accepted in contravention of Section 167, for example, a contribution in excess of a contributor's limit, the chief financial officer shall, within 30 days after learning of the contravention, advise the local jurisdiction or the registrar in writing of the fact and circumstances and return the contribution in accordance with the directions of the local jurisdiction or registrar. Section 176 sub 3 has similar requirements for the return of advertising contributions not belonging to the contributor. The chief financial officer shall advise the local jurisdiction or registrar in writing of the fact and circumstances and return the advertising contribution in accordance with the directions of the local jurisdiction or registrar. How to determine the form and manner of receipts for contributions is explained in Section 177. A third party must issue receipts for every advertising contribution they accept in the form and manner approved by the local jurisdiction in which it is registered, or the provincial registrar if applicable. At a minimum, receipts should include the date of the contribution, the name and address of the contributor, and the amount contributed. Every third party who engages in election advertising is required to file a report regarding advertising contributions received during the election advertising period in the prescribed form, which is Form 28. This report must be filed with the local jurisdiction or provincial registrar by March 1st following a general election. So let's take a look at some of those requirements.
Every third party who engages in election advertising must file a report regarding advertising contributions received during the election advertising period in the prescribed form. This report must be filed with the local jurisdiction or the provincial registrar by March 1st following a general election. Newly added as of May 15, 2025, is also a requirement to file an election advertising return by September 30th in respect of the period beginning on May 1st and ending on July 31st of 2025. Remember that Form 28 is used for the purposes of Section 180. The advertising return under Section 182 does not have a corresponding form. The information required by Section 182 must be filed by the Chief Financial Officer of the third-party advertiser, either with the local jurisdiction or the provincial registrar. The advertising return must include a financial statement, a list of all advertising contributions received during the election advertising period. This list must set out for each contributor who made election advertising contributions totaling more than $250, the contributor's name and address, and the amount and date of each advertising contribution. An election advertising spending limit report referred to in Section 165 sub 4. The time and place of broadcast or publication of the advertisements to which the election advertising expenses relate, and any supporting information and documents relating to the election advertising return. Section 183 requires that any surplus funds in an election advertising account at the end of an election advertising period must be held in the account for advertising during a subsequent election advertising period. If a registered third party decides not to expend the funds for election advertising during the next election advertising period, the third party must deal with the surplus within 6 months by transferring the surplus to the election advertising accounts of other third parties in accordance with Section 178, donating the funds to a registered charity, returning the surplus to the third party's contributors if they can be identified, or if any portion of it cannot be dealt with in any of the ways listed above, pay that portion to the party with whom they have registered.
That concludes Module 4. Please remember to review our additional election resources online. If you have questions about school board elections, please contact Alberta Education. And remember that updated versions of the MGA and LEEA can be accessed or ordered through the King's printer. Questions about elections database can be sent to our information services team.